It was a cold winter morning when Marcus, a solitary man living in the mountains, found the wolf. He had been out on a routine walk, enjoying the silence of the forest, when he stumbled upon her, lying on the frozen ground, struggling for breath. Her once vibrant coat was now matted and dirty, and her body was dangerously thin. She was pregnant, her ribs clearly visible through her fur. The deep blue of the sky was muted by the cloud cover, and the forest around him seemed eerily quiet. At first, Marcus thought she was dead. There was no movement, no sound, just the stillness of a creature in its final moments. But as he drew closer, he saw her chest rise and fall faintly. His heart skipped a beat. She was still alive. Barely. He hesitated. There was no way he could help her. He had no experience with animals like this. The idea of trying to save her seemed ridiculous. But something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in years. He knelt beside the wolf, and in that moment, the world seemed to pause. The wind stopped, the snow fell more softly, and all that existed was the fragile creature in front of him. With a sigh, Marcus made his decision. He couldn't leave her here to die. He wasn't sure why, but he knew he had to try. With great care, he lifted her into his arms, wincing at her weight. Her body was cold, and her breathing shallow, but she was still alive. He carried her back to his cabin, unsure of how he would manage to nurse her back to health. He had no veterinary knowledge, no tools, and no guarantee of success. But he had one thing, the will to try. Inside the cabin, he gently laid her on the floor near the hearth. The fire was low, but he stoked it higher, hoping the warmth would help. His mind raced, thinking of what he could do to keep her alive. He'd need food, water, and something to keep her comfortable. He had a few cans of meat stored away for emergencies. They weren't ideal, but it was the best he could offer. As he worked quickly, the wolf's eyes flickered open. Her gaze was distant, filled with fear and confusion, but there was something else, something almost human. She looked at him as if trying to understand what was happening. Her chest heaved in pain, but she didn't move. The trust between them, though fragile, had already begun to form. For the next few days, Marcus stayed by her side, feeding her and tending to her wounds as best as he could. He had no idea how long it would take, or if she would even survive. But each day she seemed a little stronger. Her eyes, once clouded with pain, began to clear. And though she never showed much affection, Marcus could see her growing comfort in his presence. The days passed slowly, filled with uncertainty. The world outside remained unchanged, silent, cold, and indifferent. But in his cabin, a bond was quietly forming. The man and the wolf. Two unlikely companions brought together by a moment of mercy and a decision that neither of them fully understood. But Marcus didn't know something. He didn't know that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would change his life forever. He didn't know that the wolf's pack was out there, waiting for the right moment. And most of all, he didn't know that this single choice to save a dying animal would lead him into a world of mystery, loyalty, and danger, things he could never have anticipated. As the wolf grew stronger, Marcus had to wonder, would she leave once she was healed? Would she return to her pack? And if so, what would happen then? Little did he know, the wolf had already made her decision. And soon, so would he. Days turned into weeks, and the winter snow continued to blanket the forest, making every step outside a struggle. But inside Marcus's cabin, something remarkable was happening. The wolf, once weak and nearly lifeless, was beginning to regain her strength. Her fur was slowly starting to glisten again, and her eyes, once dull, had started to shine with a quiet intelligence. Marcus found himself deeply invested in her recovery, far more than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about saving her anymore, it was about a connection that had quietly formed between them. He could sense that she was no longer just a wounded animal, she was something more, something that shared his solitude, his isolation, his struggles. She looked at him as though she understood him. And, strangely, he began to understand her too. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, watching as she rested beside him, occasionally lifting her head to look out the window as if waiting for something. There were moments when their eyes met, and he could feel a silent communication pass between them. He had no idea how or why, but he knew she was grateful. Maybe not in a way he could fully comprehend, but he felt it nonetheless. The man's life had always been solitary. Years of living alone had hardened him. He had distanced himself from the world, from people. The loss of his family, the disconnection from his past, it all pushed him to the fringes of society. He hadn't expected to find comfort in the presence of an animal, let alone a wolf. But here he was, slowly finding a companionship he had never thought possible. As the wolf grew stronger, Marcus felt a mixture of hope and worry. He knew the day would come when he would have to release her. She wasn't his pet, and he couldn't keep her locked away forever. She belonged in the wild, and despite the bond they had formed, he knew that was where she would be happiest. But with each passing day, his attachment to her deepened. The thought of letting her go was painful, and he found himself questioning if it was the right thing to do. Could he really set her free after everything they had been through together? After all, she wasn't just a wolf, she had become a part of his life. One afternoon, as Marcus went about his usual chores, he heard something unexpected, an eerie howl. His heart skipped a beat. The wolf, who had been lying in front of the hearth, suddenly stood up, her ears perked. She tilted her head, as if listening to the sound. Then, with a swift movement, she bounded to the door, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the wilderness outside. The howl echoed again, louder this time, and Marcus felt an odd stirring in his chest. The sound wasn't unfamiliar to him, it was a wolf's call. But this wasn't just one wolf, it was a pack. He knew it immediately. The call was unmistakable. The wolf, who had been nursed back to health in his care, now stood at the door, her posture alert, as if she was being drawn to something. Marcus froze, his mind racing. Was this the moment? Was this the time when she would leave? For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The wolf's eyes, filled with something between hesitation and recognition, never left his face. The silence in the cabin was deafening, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. And then, as if the decision had already been made, the wolf turned and sprinted out the door into the wilderness, disappearing into the snow-covered trees. Marcus stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what to do. Should he chase after her? Was she going to return to the pack, or had he lost her forever? As he stood there, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. His companion, the animal he had fought so hard to save, was now gone, just as quickly as she had come into his life. But in his heart, he knew this was the way it had to be. The wolf didn't belong to him, she was wild, free, and part of something far greater than he could ever understand. It was then that Marcus realized that his connection with her had not been about ownership or control. It had been about something much deeper, trust, compassion, and the shared experience of survival. She had needed him, and in return, he had found a rare kind of peace in her presence. But that peace was fleeting, and now, as he gazed out into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The howl of the pack still echoed in his ears, a haunting reminder that there was much more to this story than he could ever have imagined. The wolf was gone, but something inside Marcus told him that the pack would return, and when they did, everything would change. The days following the wolf's departure were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Marcus went about his routines, feeding the fire, chopping wood, and repairing his cabin, but his mind was consumed by the memory of her. The howl of the pack still rang in his ears, an eerie reminder that something had shifted in the world around him. He could no longer ignore the deep sense of curiosity and unease that gnawed at him. Had she gone back to her pack? Was she safe? He found himself looking out into the forest, half expecting to see her emerge from the trees, her coat gleaming in the soft light of the setting sun. But each time, there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of snow and trees, as quiet and still as ever. Marcus tried to push the thoughts aside. He reminded himself that he had done the right thing. The wolf belonged in the wild. She was never meant to stay in his cabin. Yet, the more he tried to convince himself, the more uncertain he became. There was something about her, something about the way she had looked at him with those intelligent eyes, that made him wonder if she wasn't just another animal. The silence of the wilderness, once a comfort, now felt hollow. It was as if he were waiting for something he couldn't quite name. Then, one afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, Marcus was out chopping wood when he heard something in the distance. A rustling sound, low and rhythmic, followed by a faint, familiar howl. His heart raced, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. The pack was back. Marcus froze, his axe still in mid-swing. His mind spun with questions. Why had they come back? Were they searching for the wolf he had saved? Did they know he had helped her? Or was this something entirely different? He quickly dropped the axe and hurried back to the cabin, his pulse quickening with each step. The air felt different now, charged with the unknown. As he reached the door, he stopped. He hesitated for just a moment before stepping outside into the cold evening air. There, in the clearing before his cabin, stood the pack. The wolves were gathered in a loose formation, their eyes trained on him, their bodies tense yet not threatening. The wind carried their scent, wild and strong, and Marcus could feel the weight of their gaze upon him. He had never seen them so close before, he had always been an observer, watching them from a distance when they passed through the forest. But now, they were right here, right in front of him. The wolf he had saved was at the front, her eyes locked with his. She stood there, her posture calm, but there was something unmistakably different about her. She wasn't just any wolf. She was the leader, or at least, she had assumed that role. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what to do. He had always kept his distance from the wild, respected it from afar, but now he was standing in the middle of it. The pack didn't seem to be aggressive, but he knew better than to assume anything. They were powerful, capable of anything. Then, as if the wolf had read his thoughts, she stepped forward. Slowly, cautiously, she approached him, her gaze never wavering. The rest of the pack watched her every move, waiting, poised for any sign of danger. When she was close enough, she stopped and tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. There was an almost human quality to her actions, a deep understanding in her eyes that sent a chill through Marcus's spine. It was as if she knew something he didn't. For a moment, there was silence, the world around them frozen in time. Then, without warning, the wolf made a low, deep growl. It wasn't a threat, but a signal. Slowly, the rest of the pack moved forward, encircling him. They didn't growl, didn't show their teeth, they simply stood there, waiting. Marcus swallowed hard. His mind raced. What did they want from him? Why were they here? Was this some sort of test? Or was this the pack's way of thanking him for saving one of their own? The leader wolf, the one he had saved, looked at him once more, her gaze softening just a little, as if reassuring him that there was no immediate danger. She had brought the pack here for a reason, but Marcus still couldn't understand it. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the wolves turned and began to move deeper into the forest. The pack, following the leader, disappeared into the trees without a word. Marcus stood there, frozen, his mind racing. What had just happened? Why had they come? And what did it mean? That night, as he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the questions kept swirling in his head. He had saved the wolf, but he hadn't expected this connection, this presence. What had she meant when she looked at him like that? What was the pack trying to tell him? He didn't know, but one thing was certain: this encounter was far from over. The pack had come to him for a reason, and somehow, he was now part of their story, whether he understood it or not. And if he was to unravel the mystery, he would have to wait. He had no choice but to trust that, somehow, the answers would come. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling quiet. The pack had disappeared into the forest, and for a while, Marcus had convinced himself that their visit was just a strange moment of curiosity. Perhaps they had simply been checking on the wolf he had saved, ensuring she was okay. But something told him it wasn't that simple. Something had shifted between them, something that could not be easily explained. Marcus tried to go back to his routine, cutting wood, repairing the cabin, and even hunting. But the forest felt different now. The wolves were no longer just distant figures in the wild, they were part of his reality, just beyond the edges of his understanding. He would sometimes hear distant howls echoing through the trees, but no matter how much he hoped for another encounter, the pack remained hidden, their presence felt but unseen. It wasn't until one evening, as the sun began to set, that Marcus's life would change once again. He had just finished a long day of work and was sitting on his porch, the chill of the evening settling into his bones, when he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling in the bushes. His heart skipped. He didn't need to turn around to know what it was. He rose from his chair slowly, his body tense, his senses heightened. The air was still, the only sound the faint whisper of wind through the trees. Then, through the underbrush, emerged the wolf, the one he had saved, her coat now glossy and healthy, her eyes bright with an intelligence that still unnerved him. But she wasn't alone. The pack followed closely behind her, for wolves, their eyes shining in the fading light, their movements graceful and deliberate. They didn't approach Marcus immediately, instead, they hung back, watching him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The leader of the pack, the wolf he had saved, stepped forward, her gaze fixed on him. For a long moment, no one moved. Marcus stood frozen, unsure of what to do. His mind raced. Why had they returned? What did they want from him now? He had never expected this, never imagined that his connection with the wolf would lead to something like this. Then, without warning, the leader wolf stepped even closer, her movements smooth and purposeful. She came right up to him, her eyes never leaving his. There was a softness in her gaze, an understanding that spoke volumes. And for the first time since she had entered his life, Marcus felt a deep sense of clarity. This was no ordinary wolf. She was not just an animal. She was something more. The wolves surrounding her were also watching, waiting. Their behavior was almost human. They seemed to respect Marcus, not as a threat but as a part of their world. It was as though they understood the role he had played in saving one of their own. The leader wolf paused in front of Marcus, then, to his surprise, she nudged him gently with her nose. It was a gesture of affection, or perhaps gratitude. He hadn't expected that. In all his life, he had never known an animal to act this way. It was as if she had accepted him into their fold, as though he were no longer an outsider, but something more, a member of their world. Marcus's heart swelled with emotion. He knelt down to her level, slowly and cautiously, unsure of how she might react. He reached out a hand, tentatively, and she allowed him to touch her fur. It was soft, warm, and alive with the energy of the wild. He felt a deep connection to her in that moment, a bond forged by kindness, respect, and an understanding of something beyond words. But just as quickly as the moment of peace had arrived, it was gone. The pack stirred, and the leader wolf pulled away from him. She turned, her eyes locking with his one last time. Then, with a final glance at her pack, she led them into the forest. Marcus watched them disappear into the shadows of the trees, a sense of awe and confusion washing over him. What had just happened? Had he truly been accepted into their world? Or was there something more to this connection than he could understand? That night, as he sat alone by the fire, the questions kept swirling in his mind. What was the pack's true purpose in coming to him? Why had they shown such trust, such respect? And what did the wolf's gesture mean? He had always believed that humans and wild creatures existed in separate worlds, but now he wasn't so sure. The wolves had shown him something different, something that challenged everything he had ever known. But despite his uncertainty, one thing was clear: the pack was watching him. They had come back for a reason, and it was only a matter of time before Marcus would learn what that reason was. The wilderness around him was no longer just a place of solitude. It had become a place of mystery, of connection, and of forces beyond his comprehension. And as he sat there, staring into the flames, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just crossed into a new chapter, one that would be forever shaped by the wolves. The days following the wolf's return were filled with an uneasy sense of anticipation. Marcus could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on him from every direction. The wolves had come back, but they hadn't stayed. Their visit had been brief, but it had left him with more questions than answers. He went back to his usual routine, but nothing felt the same. The air seemed heavier, the trees taller, and the mountains more imposing. It was as if the very landscape around him was waiting for something he was not yet ready to face. He would often catch himself staring out into the forest, half expecting to see the wolves again, but each time, the trees remained empty, silent. Yet, in the stillness, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond his reach, something important, something he was meant to understand. One evening, as the sky turned deep purple and the cold of night began to settle over the land, Marcus stood on his porch, gazing out at the stars. The winter air was crisp, and the howl of a distant wolf echoed through the trees, a reminder of the strange bond that had formed between him and the wild creatures of the forest. His mind drifted back to the moment when the pack had approached him, how they had surrounded him with such calm and purpose. The memory still left him with a sense of awe and wonder, but now, it also filled him with a deeper understanding. He hadn't realized it at the time, but the wolves' visit had been more than just a passing moment of curiosity. They had come to him for a reason. He wasn't just a man in the woods anymore. He had become something more to them, part of their world, a part of their story. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard a rustling sound coming from the edge of the forest. It wasn't the usual sounds of the wind or small animals, this was different. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate. His heart raced, and instinctively, he turned toward the sound. There, emerging from the trees, was the pack. The leader wolf was at the front, her eyes fixed on him with a quiet intensity. Behind her, the others moved in sync, their bodies sleek and powerful. They didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. They moved closer, coming toward the cabin. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He knew this wasn't a random visit. The wolves had returned for a reason, and they were not here for idle curiosity. Something had changed, and he could feel the gravity of the moment settling over him. As the pack approached, the leader wolf stopped a few feet away from Marcus. She didn't make any sound, but the tension in the air was palpable. The other wolves gathered behind her, forming a loose circle around him. There was no hostility in their movements, but there was a quiet determination in the way they carried themselves. It was as if they were waiting for him to understand something. Marcus felt a shiver run down his spine, a deep instinct telling him that something important was about to unfold. He swallowed hard, unsure of what to do or say. The pack was silent, but there was an unspoken communication between them. Without warning, the leader wolf stepped forward again, her gaze never leaving Marcus's. She moved with grace, her body a fluid motion of strength and purpose. As she reached him, she stopped and turned her head toward the trees behind him. Marcus followed her gaze, his eyes scanning the darkened forest, but he saw nothing. Then, something happened that Marcus could never have anticipated. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the shadows of the trees. It wasn't the sound of one wolf, it was a chorus of deep, resonant growls, like a challenge from the wilderness itself. Marcus's heart raced. The pack, sensing the shift in the air, bristled with tension, their eyes fixed on the source of the sound. Out of the darkness emerged another wolf, larger and more imposing than any of the others. It wasn't part of the pack Marcus had come to know. This wolf was different, wild, untamed, with a fierceness in its eyes that sent a surge of fear through Marcus's chest. The new wolf's presence was overwhelming, and for a moment, he wondered if this was a predator, a challenge to the pack's territory. But the leader wolf didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped forward to face the newcomer. There was no aggression in her stance, but her body was tense, her fur bristling with resolve. The pack gathered closer, forming a protective barrier around her. Marcus watched, his breath catching in his throat. He had no idea what was happening. What was this new wolf doing here? And why did the leader wolf seem so resigned? The tension in the air was suffocating. For what felt like an eternity, the two wolves stood facing each other, two powerful forces of nature locked in a silent standoff. And then, to Marcus's amazement, the leader wolf did something unexpected. She lowered her head, her eyes softening, and took a few cautious steps back. The new wolf advanced, its presence commanding, but it did not attack. Instead, it circled the leader wolf, its movements deliberate. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation, the uncertainty of what was to come. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was something deeper, something that had been building ever since he had saved the pregnant wolf. And then, just as suddenly as the moment had begun, the new wolf turned and disappeared into the shadows. The leader wolf let out a soft growl, as if to signal that the danger had passed. The pack relaxed, their bodies no longer tense, but the leader remained watchful, her eyes scanning the trees, as though expecting something else. The moment hung in the air like a fog, thick with mystery and meaning. The pack didn't move immediately. They lingered, their gaze now resting on Marcus as though waiting for him to understand something he hadn't yet realized. Finally, the leader wolf turned and looked at him, her gaze softening once more. Then, without a sound, she and the pack retreated into the forest. Marcus stood there, stunned, the questions swirling in his mind. What had just happened? Who was the new wolf? What did it mean that the leader wolf had stepped back, allowing it to pass? One thing was clear, Marcus was no longer an outsider. The wilderness had changed for him. The wolves had brought him into their world, and now, it seemed, the forces of that world were beginning to reveal themselves. And as he watched the pack disappear into the night, he knew this was only the beginning of a story much greater than anything he could have imagined. The days following the pack's strange visit left Marcus in a state of unease. He couldn't shake the image of the new wolf, the one that had appeared from the shadows and commanded the pack with such raw power. The way the leader wolf had stepped back, seemingly yielding to it, left him with a gnawing feeling that something was amiss, something he didn't fully understand. Why had she allowed the newcomer to take command, even if only for a moment? And why had the pack been so silent, so patient? Marcus tried to continue with his life. He chopped wood, hunted when necessary, and maintained the cabin, but his mind was far from focused. He had been a man of solitude, but now, it seemed, his life had become entwined with the mysteries of the wilderness. The wolves, this pack, had become a part of his existence, whether he liked it or not. But the unknown still haunted him. The forest, once a place of peace, now felt heavy with secrets, with untold stories that he wasn't privy to. One evening, after the sun had set and the cold of night settled in, Marcus sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. The warmth of the fire was comforting, but the questions in his mind wouldn't let him rest. The howl of a wolf echoed through the trees, distant and mournful. Marcus looked up, his heartbeat quickening. It was the same howl he had heard the night the pack had appeared, the same sound that had sent him racing toward the clearing, heart in his throat, only to find the pack standing in front of him, waiting. He had learned to recognize the call of the pack, but this one was different. It wasn't just a solitary howl, it was a series of howls, overlapping, as if the wolves were communicating with one another. There was a tension in the air, something unsettled. The wolves were calling to each other, but they were not in harmony. There was an underlying discord, a sense of urgency that Marcus couldn't ignore. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat, tucked a rifle into his bag for protection, and stepped out into the cold night air. The howl echoed again, much closer now. It sent a shiver down his spine, and without a second thought, Marcus moved toward the sound, following it into the trees. The forest was eerily quiet as he walked, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath his boots. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the cold wind bit at his face. He knew this path well, but tonight, it felt unfamiliar, as if the forest itself was shifting around him. The howls grew louder, and Marcus quickened his pace. He didn't know what he was walking toward, but instinct told him he was headed in the right direction. Eventually, he reached a clearing. The snow was deep, and the moonlight shone down on the forest in an almost surreal glow. But there, in the middle of the clearing, was something he didn't expect, something that made his heart race and his stomach twist in a way he had never felt before. The pack was there. But they weren't alone. The new wolf, the one that had arrived from the shadows, stood at the edge of the clearing. It was massive, its fur darker than night, its eyes glowing with a strange, unnatural intensity. It wasn't just watching the pack, it was leading them. The leader wolf, the one Marcus had saved, was standing beside it, her posture lower than usual, almost submissive. The other wolves, who had once shown him such respect, now seemed to fall in line, their bodies tense as they watched the newcomer. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. What was happening? Why had the pack returned to this place, and why had they brought the new wolf with them? He felt as if he had stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see, something far greater than he had anticipated. As he stepped closer, trying to stay hidden behind the trees, he saw the new wolf take a step forward. Its eyes locked on the leader wolf. A low growl escaped its throat, deep and threatening, but the leader wolf didn't react. Instead, she lowered her head and took a step back, as though acknowledging the newcomer's dominance. A cold chill ran through Marcus. This wasn't a simple territorial dispute. This was something deeper, something far more complex. The new wolf was not just a threat to the pack, it was a force that commanded respect, a presence that was reshaping the very dynamics of the group. The leader wolf looked over her shoulder, her eyes briefly meeting Marcus's, as though aware of his presence. She didn't look scared, just resigned. And in that moment, Marcus realized something he had been unwilling to admit until now: she was not the leader anymore. The pack's allegiance had shifted, and the new wolf had claimed its place at the top of the hierarchy. Marcus's mind raced. What was this new wolf? Was it the alpha of another pack? Had it come to take over? Or was there something more to it? He had saved the pregnant wolf, but now, he was caught in the middle of a power struggle, a battle for control that he couldn't possibly understand. He didn't know how long he stood there, watching in silence, as the pack and the new wolf faced each other. The tension in the clearing was thick, and Marcus could feel it pressing in on him, like the weight of the entire forest. There was no fight, no violence, just a quiet, unspoken understanding between the leader wolf and the newcomer. Finally, the new wolf turned and walked away, its massive form disappearing into the trees. The pack followed closely behind, the leader wolf taking up the rear. As they vanished into the shadows, Marcus felt a sense of loss, of confusion. What had just happened? And what did it mean for him? He stood there for a long time, his mind reeling. He had always thought of himself as an outsider in the wilderness, but now, he was something more. The wolves had brought him into their world, and now, he was entangled in their struggles. This was no longer just about one act of kindness. It was about something much bigger, something that reached far beyond his understanding. With a heavy heart, Marcus turned and made his way back to the cabin. He didn't have answers, just more questions. The forest around him was no longer silent. It was alive with the sounds of wolves, of power, of survival, and of a mystery that was unfolding one step at a time. And whether he was ready or not, Marcus knew he would have to face it. The following days felt like an endless stretch of uncertainty. Marcus spent more time than he cared to admit staring out into the trees, waiting for something, anything, that might offer him some answers. The pack had disappeared into the forest after the encounter with the new wolf, and since then, there had been no sign of them. The howls, which had once been a constant presence in his life, were now a rare occurrence. The forest, once filled with the sounds of the wild, felt eerily quiet. Marcus tried to return to his normal life, but it was hard. He was no longer just a man living alone in the woods. The wolves had changed that. The pack had come into his life, and now, the very fabric of his existence seemed to be intertwined with theirs. He couldn't ignore the weight of the situation. He had saved one of their own, and now, he was entangled in a power struggle that he barely understood. The uncertainty gnawed at him every day. He would wake in the morning, sit at his cabin window, and wait for a glimpse of the wolves. But the forest remained still. Even the animals seemed to sense the shift. The birds no longer sang as they once had, and the squirrels and rabbits kept their distance, as though the balance of the wilderness had been disrupted. It wasn't until a week later that the wolves returned, but when they did, it wasn't like before. Marcus was outside, chopping wood as usual, when he heard it, a single, powerful howl that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the leader wolf. The sound of her call was unmistakable. But it wasn't just her voice that filled the air. The pack was with her, and there was something different about their presence this time. Their howls were filled with urgency, their voices carrying an edge of command, as though they were calling for something, or someone. His heart raced, and without thinking, Marcus dropped his axe and ran toward the clearing. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew he had to find out. As he neared the clearing, he saw them. The pack was standing at the edge of the trees, their eyes focused on something just beyond the treeline. The leader wolf stood at the front, her posture tense and alert. But it was the new wolf, the massive, dark creature that had shown up days earlier, that caught Marcus's attention. It was standing next to her, its eyes scanning the horizon with a fierce intensity. The other wolves were watching, waiting. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, but no one moved. The stillness in the air was almost suffocating. Marcus didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't stay away. He stepped forward cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The wolves turned their heads to acknowledge his presence, but they didn't react with hostility. They didn't growl or bare their teeth. They simply watched him, as if they were waiting for him to understand something. The leader wolf's gaze met his, and for a moment, it felt as though she was speaking directly to him. There was no sound, no words, but the intensity of her eyes conveyed everything. She was saying something, something important, and Marcus couldn't help but feel that this moment was pivotal. Then, the new wolf moved. With a low, guttural growl, it stepped forward, its eyes locked on Marcus. There was no aggression in its movements, but the presence of its power was undeniable. The other wolves watched in silence, their attention fixed on the two of them. The leader wolf didn't step in to intervene. She remained still, her gaze shifting between Marcus and the newcomer, as if assessing the situation. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. What was this? Was the new wolf challenging him? Without thinking, Marcus stood his ground. He had no intention of backing down. But as the dark wolf came closer, he noticed something, a faint scent on the wind. It wasn't just the wildness of the forest. It was the scent of something familiar, something that had been with him for days. It took him a moment to realize what it was the scent of fear. The dark wolf was afraid. But why? Before Marcus could process this revelation, the leader wolf made a soft sound, a low, almost imperceptible whine. The new wolf froze in place, its body stiffening as though it had received a command. It paused for a moment, then slowly, almost reluctantly, stepped back. The pack, as if in unison, shifted its stance, retreating slightly to form a loose circle around the two of them. Marcus felt the tension in the air dissipate, but only slightly. He still didn't understand what had just happened. Why had the new wolf stepped back? Was it afraid of something, or had the leader wolf exerted some kind of authority over it? Before he could ask himself any more questions, the pack turned as one and began to move into the trees. The leader wolf glanced at Marcus once more, her eyes softening, then followed the others into the forest. The new wolf lagged behind, looking back at Marcus with something that might have been recognition, perhaps even a kind of grudging respect. As the pack disappeared into the shadows, Marcus stood there, breathless, trying to make sense of the encounter. What had just happened? What was the significance of the new wolf's retreat? And what role did he, a man living alone in the wilderness, play in this strange, unspoken power struggle? The night felt colder now, the silence of the forest pressing in around him. But as the howls of the pack faded into the distance, Marcus knew that the questions he had been asking weren't going to be answered anytime soon. The wolves had made it clear, they had come to him for a reason. And until he understood that reason, he would remain a part of their world, caught between the wild and the unknown. The days that followed the pack's sudden departure were some of the longest Marcus had ever endured. The wilderness, which had once been his sanctuary, now felt like a place of hidden dangers. The silence was overwhelming, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The wolves had returned to their shadowy world, and Marcus was left standing on the edge, trying to make sense of a mystery that seemed too vast for him to comprehend. He tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on his daily life, chopping wood, hunting, maintaining the cabin, but the questions continued to gnaw at him. Why had the pack returned? Why had the new wolf retreated when the leader wolf made her call? What was the role he played in all of this? These were questions he couldn't answer alone. The forest felt strange now. It wasn't just the quiet or the unsettling feeling that seemed to hang in the air, it was something deeper. Marcus could feel the presence of the wolves even when they weren't near. The way the trees seemed to shift in the wind, the distant howls that echoed on occasion, everything felt different. He wasn't sure if it was his growing connection to the pack or if the wilderness itself had changed, but either way, his life had become tangled with the wolves in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, as the moon rose high in the sky, Marcus was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. He had just finished another long day of work, but the weariness in his bones was nothing compared to the confusion in his mind. He knew the pack would return eventually, but he didn't know when or why. The quiet was unbearable, and the unanswered questions only made it worse. It was then that he heard it, a faint, almost inaudible sound at first, but one that made his blood run cold. A soft rustling in the trees, followed by a low, guttural growl. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. It was the wolves. They were back. Marcus stood up slowly, his breath shallow as he moved toward the door. The growls were getting closer now, but they weren't coming from the direction of the pack's usual territory. This sound was coming from the opposite side of his cabin, closer than he had ever felt the wolves before. He stepped outside cautiously, his eyes scanning the darkness. The moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy above, casting everything in eerie shadow. The air was cold, the wind biting against his skin. And then, there they were. The wolves. But this time, something was different. They weren't moving as a pack. There were no howls, no synchronized movements. It was as though they were scattered, moving with a purpose but without their usual unity. The leader wolf was at the front, her posture low and tense. Her eyes were wide, her body poised for something. Behind her, the rest of the pack was scattered, their movements jerky and erratic. It was clear that something was wrong. And then, Marcus saw it. The new wolf, the dark and imposing creature, was standing off to the side, watching them with its glowing eyes. But it wasn't the same wolf he had seen before. There was something different about it now. Its body was tense, its fur bristling with an unnatural energy. The other wolves were looking at it, their eyes filled with something that resembled fear. The leader wolf turned toward Marcus, her eyes meeting his for a split second. There was no recognition in her gaze, only urgency. Without warning, she took a step toward him, but the pack didn't follow. Instead, they remained still, their attention locked on the new wolf. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. The new wolf hadn't made any move toward him, but the tension in the air was palpable. It was as though the wolves were waiting for something, something that had yet to happen, something that was about to unfold. The leader wolf gave another low growl, this time directed at the new wolf. The growl wasn't aggressive, but it was full of command, as though she were trying to assert her authority. But the new wolf didn't respond. It just stood there, its eyes glowing brighter now, its body coiled like a spring, ready to pounce. Marcus stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He could feel the power radiating from the wolves, the tension was thick enough to cut through the air. Something was happening here, something that had been building ever since he had first saved the pregnant wolf. Without warning, the new wolf lunged. The pack reacted in an instant. The leader wolf darted forward, but it wasn't to attack. Instead, she moved with speed and precision, positioning herself between the new wolf and Marcus. The rest of the pack followed suit, circling the dark wolf, their eyes locked onto it with unwavering focus. Marcus could barely breathe. His heart raced as he watched the standoff unfold before him. The leader wolf, the new wolf, and the pack, each one stood frozen in a delicate balance of power. No one moved, no one made a sound, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The new wolf's eyes narrowed, and it growled again, but this time, the sound wasn't as powerful. It was strained, as if the energy that had been driving it was beginning to wane. Slowly, reluctantly, it took a step back. The leader wolf didn't move, but she didn't have to. Her presence alone was enough to force the new wolf to retreat. The pack stood its ground, their bodies tense, but they didn't attack. Instead, they formed a barrier around Marcus, as though protecting him from the unseen danger that loomed in the darkness. The new wolf growled once more, but it was softer now, more distant. And with that, it turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the night. The leader wolf stayed still, her eyes searching the forest as if she were expecting something else. The pack didn't move, their gaze still fixed on the place where the new wolf had disappeared. After a long moment, the leader wolf gave a final, almost imperceptible nod. She turned, her body flowing with ease, and the pack followed her into the forest. Marcus stood there, his breath ragged in the cold night air, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had no idea what had just happened. The tension between the wolves had been palpable, something had shifted, something he couldn't fully understand. But one thing was clear, the pack was no longer the same. As the last of the wolves disappeared into the trees, Marcus realized that he had just witnessed the unraveling of something far greater than he could have imagined. The wilderness, once a peaceful refuge, was now a place of power, of alliances, and of shifting forces. And as the night closed in around him, Marcus knew that his life would never be the same. The days that followed the standoff in the forest were quieter than Marcus had expected. The air felt heavy, as though the events of the past week had shifted something in the world around him, something irreversible. The pack hadn't returned, and the silence in the wilderness had become unbearable. The tension that had hung in the air now seemed to settle into the very fabric of the forest, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Marcus went about his usual routines, chopping wood, tending to his cabin, and hunting. But everything had changed. The wolves, particularly the leader, had come into his life for a reason, and now he understood that. He wasn't just a passive observer in the wilderness. He was entangled in the intricate web of nature's order, caught in the shifting balance between power, respect, and survival. For the first time in years, Marcus felt truly connected to something bigger than himself. The isolation that had once been a comfort was now something else entirely. The wolves had shown him a world he hadn't known existed, one where every movement mattered, where every decision carried weight, and where the forces of nature were in constant flux. As he sat on the porch of his cabin one evening, looking out at the darkening forest, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He had saved a pregnant wolf, and in return, his life had become entwined with the wolf's struggle for survival. He had witnessed the complex dynamics of the pack, the emergence of the new wolf, and the silent battle for leadership that had unfolded before him. It had been a world of mystery and power that he could barely comprehend, yet it had all been laid bare in front of him. Marcus had often wondered about the meaning of life in his solitary existence. He had lived alone for so long, pushing away the world, protecting himself from the pain of loss. But the wolves had taught him something that had changed the way he saw everything. They had shown him that survival was not just about living, it was about connection. It was about understanding the delicate balance between strength and vulnerability, leadership and loyalty. It was about empathy, even for those who might seem so different from oneself. The leader wolf had never asked for his help. She had never needed his intervention. But by saving her, Marcus had become part of something much greater, a part of the wild, a part of the untamed forces that governed the world. He had been given a gift, but it was not a gift he had sought. It was a gift born of mercy, a gift that had forced him to step outside his comfort zone and confront the larger, more mysterious world around him. The silence of the forest was broken by the soft rustle of the wind. Marcus stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, and looked out at the trees. He didn't know if the pack would return. He didn't know if the new wolf would come back to challenge the leader again. But he knew one thing for certain, he would be ready. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting a silver glow over the land, Marcus felt a deep, peaceful understanding wash over him. The wilderness wasn't just a place for survival, it was a place for growth. And the wolves, in their own way, had taught him that. They had shown him that true strength wasn't just about dominance, it was about respect, about understanding the power of the world around you and using it wisely. The wind whispered through the trees, and Marcus could almost hear the faintest sound of howls in the distance. It wasn't the pack's usual call, but it was a sound that was familiar, comforting, even. The wolves were out there, somewhere, still watching, still waiting. And though he might never fully understand their world, Marcus knew that he was part of it now. In the end, the greatest lesson he had learned was that sometimes, the simplest acts of kindness and compassion can lead to the most profound changes. His life had been shaped by the wolves, but it had also been shaped by his own choices, his willingness to step into the unknown and embrace the wild. The world was much larger than he had ever imagined. And as he watched the stars twinkle above him, Marcus knew that he would never be alone again.